10-Minute Murder contains depictions of actual crimes. What you are about to hear is real and violent in nature. Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Welcome to the brief and bingeable true crime podcast, 10-Minute Murder. I'm glad you're here. I'm Joe, the host, and salutations. I don't think I've said that with mouth words since, elementary school, when we were reading Charlotte's Web. You know how you go around the room and everyone has to read a section out loud to the class? Well, my part was salutations and greetings. When I say salutations, it's just my fancy way of saying hello or good morning. And by the way, no one prepares you for that heartbreak in that book when Charlotte dies and all of her spider babies float away. And there you are in the third grade trying to pretend like you aren't crying. Luckily, my allergies are something serious, so I can use that as a reason why my eyes are all red and teary. So, salutations. And if you're wondering right now how in the world I'm going to transition from talking about Charlotte's Web to the internet's first serial killer, I'm not really sure myself. But before I do that, make sure you're subscribed to 10-Minute Murder. If you're new here, I don't usually talk about crying in the third grade, but you lucked out today. And when you're a subscriber, you get the episodes as soon as I release them, and you don't miss any. Today, we're discussing a man named John Edward Robinson. Sometimes he goes by John Osborne, but he'd also answer to the Slave Master. He would become the internet's first serial killer. John Robinson was born in Cicero, Illinois. He had 4 siblings and 2 parents that were completely awful people. His mother was an overly strict disciplinarian. His father, a raging alcoholic. John was an Eagle Scout with aspirations of becoming a priest. He enrolled in Quigley Preparation Seminary in Chicago, but was booted after a year because he wouldn't act right. In 1961, he started at Morton Junior College in the X-ray technician program, but dropped out of there before finishing. In 1964, he moved to Kansas City and married. They had 4 children over the next several years. John's trouble with the law started in 1969. He forged credentials and worked as an X-ray tech in a doctor's office. He was caught embezzling $33,000 from his employer and was given 3 years probation. Robinson violated probation by moving back to Chicago without his probation officer's permission and took a job as an insurance salesman. And I bet you can't guess what he was arrested for a year later. Embezzling money from his employer. As a result, his probation was extended and he was forced back to Kansas City. After another arrest a few years later for securities and mail fraud, it was extended yet again. Life of white-collar crime wasn't keeping John Robinson from maintaining an outward appearance of being a stable human being. He was a scoutmaster, a baseball coach, and a Sunday school teacher, which should probably scare all of us a little bit. John was on the board of a charity and forged a series of letters to the mayor of Kansas City, earning himself the Man of the Year award. The picture of this background that we're painting here is that John Robinson was a slippery guy without a moral compass or regard for the law. 1 year after completing probation, he was arrested again for the same type of stuff. Also during this time, he was secretly trying to seduce multiple neighbors' wives, getting into a fistfight with one of the husbands after he found out. John was also in a surreptitious sadomasochism cult called the International Council of Masters, holding the rank of slave master. His duties include luring victims to gatherings to be tortured and raped by members. And then with John, the murders started. In 1984, John Robinson had 2 fraudulent shell companies. He hired 19-year-old Paula Godfrey to be a sales representative. She told everyone that John was sending her away for training. No one ever saw her again after that. Her family filed a missing persons report, and they received a typewritten letter after that stating that she no longer wanted to see her family. It had her signature at the bottom, and no trace of her was ever found. In 1985, using the name John Osborne, he met Lisa Stacy and her 4-month-old daughter, Tiffany, at a battered women's shelter. He promised Stacy a job in Chicago, an apartment, and daycare for her baby, and asked her to sign several sheets of blank stationery. A few days later, Robinson contacted his brother and sister-in-law, who had been unable to adopt the baby through traditional channels, telling them he knew of a baby whose mother had committed suicide. And for a mere $5,500 in legal fees, Don and Helen Robinson received Tiffany. Stacy was never heard from again. In 1987, Catherine Clampett, 27 years old, left her child in the care of her parents in Texas and moved to Kansas City to find a job. She was hired by Robinson, who reportedly promised her extensive travel and a new wardrobe. She vanished in June of that year. Her missing persons case remains open. From 1987 to 1993, Robinson was in prison, first in Kansas on multiple fraud convictions, and then in Missouri for another fraud conviction and parole violations. In Missouri, he met 49-year-old Beverly Bonner, the prison librarian, who, upon his release, left her husband, a prison doctor, and moved to Kansas. After Robinson arranged for Bonner's alimony checks to be forwarded to a Kansas post office box, her family never heard from her again. For several years, Bonner's mother continued forwarding her alimony checks, and Robinson continued cashing them. By then, Robinson had discovered the internet and roamed various social networking sites using the name Slave Master, looking for women who enjoyed playing the submissive partner role during sex. One of those being Sheila Faith, whose 15-year-old daughter, Debbie, was wheelchair-bound due to spina bifida. Robinson, portraying himself as a wealthy businessman and philanthropist, offered to pay Debbie's medical expenses and give Sheila a job. In 1994, the mother and daughter moved from California to Kansas City and immediately disappeared. Robinson cashed Faith's pension checks for the next 7 years. Robinson became well known in the increasingly popular BDSM online chat rooms. In 1999, he offered a job and a bondage relationship to Isabella Lewicka, a 21-year-old Polish immigrant living in Indiana. When she moved to Kansas City, Robinson, who, by the way, was still married to his wife this whole time, he gave Lewicka an engagement ring and brought her to the county registrar, where they paid for a marriage license that they never picked up. She signed a slave contract that gave Robinson almost total control of every aspect of her life, including her bank accounts. Sometime during the summer of 1999, she disappeared. Robinson told a web designer he employed that she had been caught smoking marijuana and deported. Around the time of Lewicka's disappearance, a nurse named Suzette Troughton moved from Michigan to Kansas to travel the world with Robinson as his submissive sex slave. Troughton's mother received several typed letters signed by her daughter. The letters were, her mother said, uncharacteristically mistake-free. Later, Robinson told Troughton's mother that she had run off with a friend after stealing money from him. John Robinson, over time, began to feel untouchable, and he was a bit arrogant. And that arrogance led to mistakes in covering his tracks. His name started popping up on missing person reports, and police started looking at him a little more closely. In June of 2000, the slave master was arrested at his farm for sexual battery and the theft of sex toys. This gave investigators probable cause to search his property, where they found 2 large barrels. Inside those barrels were the decaying remains of Lewicka and Troughton. In Missouri, a search of his storage facility there led to more barrels and more bodies. Bonner, Faith, and Debbie with the spina bifida had all been killed the same way, blunt force trauma to the head. In 2002, Robinson stood trial in what would be the longest criminal trial in Kansas history. He received the death sentence. He still had to face a court in Missouri for the other murders there. After some legal cat and mouse, they agreed that he would plead guilty to 5 murders there, despite a lack of evidence for that many murders, and as a result, would receive a life sentence. Robinson and his attorney were banking on the fact that Kansas hasn't put anyone to death since reinstating the death penalty in 1994. And so far, it's working out for him. The slave master John Robinson currently lives on death row in the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. As a side note, after 41 years of marriage and jail time and sex cult activity and murder convictions, in 2005, John's wife Nancy filed for divorce, citing incompatibility and irreconcilable differences.
One, two, three, four.
That's today's brief and bingeable true crime podcast, 10-Minute Murder. Hope you found today's episode interesting. If you did, Please share this show with your friends if you think they might be into a podcast like this one. A podcast where we discuss publicly crying about a children's book 1 minute, and then the next, a slave master in a sex cult. So what I'm saying is, make sure this friend has an open mind. Subscribe to 10 Minute Murder if you haven't already. Rate and review if where you listen gives you that option. Connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and see some of the visuals that go along with the episodes. Thank you for listening. Salutations.